Okay, this is the podcast to finish up the chapter on the self, chapter 4, just the remaining slides that we didn't get through the day that I had to cancel class. So I'm just going to walk you through the remaining slides and sort of just point out some important things about each one so that you kind of have that to follow. So we left off last time on the slide that dealt with self-image. We looked at the Dove beauty sketch, the women and how they describe themselves versus how a stranger described them. And we just saw how much our self-image is different from the way that others see us. We often assume others see us through the same lens that we see ourselves, but in actuality, we're hardest on ourselves, and we tend to use higher benchmarks in the social comparisons that we choose than other people would. So if we go on to the next slide, we'll continue looking at what shapes who we are. I wanted to talk a little bit about cultural influences and just how important our culture is in shaping how we think about ourselves. The self is really defined by our opinions, our attitudes, our personality traits. That really defines who we are, but all of that happens within the context of the culture in which we're raised and we grow up in. So in individualistic cultures like our own, we focus a lot on independence, being very independent over collective goals, group goals or the good of others. We're very self-focused. So the saying, make yourself stand out from the crowd, is a good sort of example of how the individualistic mindset would operate. We're always looking to promote ourselves, so there's a lot of that self-promotion. Be original, be different, do you, right? We always hear people say, you do you, and the focus is very independent versus collectivistic cultures where the focus is more on interdependence, relying on one another. Like, my piece is important, but I can't do me unless I have you, and that we all contribute to the greater good. This is a focus that zones in a lot more on the connections between individuals as being of paramount importance. So the quote, for the good of the group, is a good way to capture the focus here. And so depending upon which one of those mindsets you're coming from will affect how you view yourself. So what I have here are two different individuals sort of pitted against one another, where their personal identity, you remember we talked about that, and their social identity are very different. In independent, individualistic culture, we see people who describe themselves in very unique ways, where it's very adjective based. The personal identity is more important than the social identity. And here's what leads to intra-group comparisons. Within my group of friends, I am the adventurous one, I am hardworking, I am artistic, funny, smart, quirky. Okay, so somebody is going to go to great lengths to point out the ways in which they're different from their friends or their peers. This is their personal identity, and they're comparing within group, so intra-group. Now, in a collectivistic culture, we see people using more of a social identity. How am I in comparison to other people outside my group? So it's an inter-group comparison. And instead of seeing a lot of adjectives like we might over here in the individualistic culture, a collectivistic culture the individual would view themselves more of how they are in relation to others. So this person's, I'm a son, I'm a friend, I'm an employee, I'm a best friend, I'm a student, I'm a brother. These are all roles that a person plays in their life. So they're seeing their self-image as a compilation of the roles in which they play that are related to the other people in their lives. So they're not seeing themselves as just, here's me, here's how I stand out, but it's all hinges on how they relate to one another, which is very different from that individualistic viewpoint. So again, independent, interdependent is kind of the key focus there. There are also some personal influences that come into play when we think about things like this, and that would be introspection, thinking about your own thoughts. We used to place a big emphasis on introspection. It might not be as widely useful as we believed in the past, because our attitudes are often inconsistent with our actual behaviors, right? Thinking about what makes me me, thinking about how can I improve, how can I get better, strengths, weaknesses, that's all good, but only to the degree that you actually apply it to changing or to getting better or to addressing weaknesses. And a lot of times there's a big gap between what people think on their own about themselves and then what actually gets played out in their behavior. There's a tendency for us to use affective forecasting, which is basically trying to make a prediction, albeit a very inaccurate one, of how future events are going to affect your emotional state. So for example, you might think, if I broke up with my boyfriend, I would be really unhappy. That might not be the case. It depends on the circumstances. Oftentimes people will inaccurately predict how they think an event or something is going to make them feel. And in actuality, they don't end up feeling that way. So we know that, oftentimes this can lead to self-handicapping. Because, again, don't forget that we're often concerned with how we think other people see us. We're always sort of engaging in this process of impression management where we're very concerned with the way other people are viewing us, and we're trying to manage that impression. So we can self-handicap. We can, try to put ourselves in a position where if our ego is hurt later, we have an out. We have an excuse. We have something that will help buffer that. And we do that very often when we're looking at ourselves. Okay. How does our sense of self affect us, and how does it affect others? So here's where we transition into talking about, the effect of how I view myself and how that's going to play out with other people. And here's where we get into, again, this concept of self-monitoring. And I'm not going to go over this in detail because we talked about it a little bit already with the homework assignment. But this is basically people's willingness and ability to regulate their own behavior. How I think of myself then affects how I interact with other people. A high self-monitor, I'm very concerned with how others are going to react to me. I tend to focus on external cues of others and what their expectations are of me. I read those cues. I pay attention to those expectations. And so what I'm going to do in my behavior is change as the situation dictates and necessitates. Makes me a little bit more adaptable in terms of my behavior to others. If I'm noticing that I'm brushing someone the wrong way, I might choose to change that or address that accordingly. If I see that a situation is a delicate situation, I might change my behavior, my attitude, my nonverbal cues to adapt to that situation. That's a high self-monitor. Whereas if I'm a low self-monitor, I'm very inter-focused inside my own self. I tend to focus more on my beliefs and my behaviors as a basis for behavior and less on other people's cues and other people's behavior. So I'm focusing more on the internal, more on my own attitudes, and not paying attention as much to other people's cues that they're giving off about what they're feeling or thinking or experiencing. So that this puts me in a position of being less responsive to situational norms like, oh, hey, in this type of situation, you might not want to do that, or you might not want to go there. That's kind of not okay. I might be less attuned to that, which makes my behavior a little less adaptable to a variety of situations, circumstances, and contexts. And so that's really important. You know, how I see myself is going to be directly related to the type of monitor I am when I'm around other people. I mentioned self-handicapping briefly. This is basically setting up an obstacle before we engage in a task as a way to give ourselves a little bit of an out in case we fail or in case we don't perform well. We're more likely to self-handicap when we're nervous about something or uncertain about something. Like Bart has an important test coming up, but he finds reasons not to study for it. Then when he does bad on the test, he can say, oh, well, you know, I didn't really study enough for it. He could have studied for it, but if he really put himself out there, studied really hard, and still didn't do well, then what would his excuse be? That would hurt his ego more. So, you know, it's important to think of like how maybe we self-handicap in certain situations, maybe some of the harder situations in our life where we know we don't want to fail or failure's not an option. We might be more likely to self-handicap. Okay. We can also hold multiple social identities, and this can be beneficial. Chances are you are not just one person in life to everyone. You play different roles. You have maybe high self-complexity. And so you're less affected by failure in one domain. If you fail as a student, maybe you're still super supportive and important in your personal relationships with your family or your friends. And so that means a lot to you. So the failure in the one domain doesn't really affect you entirely. If you have a low self-complexity, it just means you're less connected maybe in different roles that you play in life. And so failure in one domain or one role would really affect you more than that of a high self-complexity individual. So holding multiple identities can provide you with a lot of benefits. Gives you definitely more opportunities for social interaction, economic mobility, and accumulation of skills and abilities. So self-complexity, people with more aspects of the self that are distinct, like I'm a mother, I'm a wife, I'm a professional. You tend to be less responsive to any threats directed at any one of those identities. So the goal here is to try to be a little more higher self-complexity. But I think the downside is that there can be identity interference, and that is just that it's hard to hold those multiple identities. It's hard to play those multiple combinations of social roles is not always easy to navigate, and sometimes those roles can be in conflict with one another. Like you may be a high corporate executive, and that doesn't mesh very well with PTO mom. The two can conflict oftentimes, and the person can find themselves trying to combat those two aspects of their identity in that way. Lastly, stereotype threat is a fear that we're going to confirm certain stereotypes that exist for our group. And so we're going to be talking more about that as we get into the chapter on stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. Oftentimes a person that knows they're part of a group that is stereotyped against might have a fear that they're going to confirm that particular stereotype, and they know other people think this of their group, and so they work really hard to try not to conform to it. So did my coworker get that promotion instead of me because I'm so overweight? Or would that state trooper have pulled me over if I were white? Like, it's me being aware that I'm part of a stereotyped group, and I kind of wear it as a chip on my shoulder. I'm always aware of it, and I let it color and filter my interactions with other people. So I just want you guys to take all of this and looking at these concepts on this last slide here, and just try to see how is self-esteem tied to social identity in a number of these different ways that we've talked about. Okay. So that wraps up the chapter slides.